Hi, this is Bailey Ronshaw from Information Technology. And for this week, assignment 11, we learned how to create various clusterings and analyze data based upon the usage of those widgets. And we learned the various processes on how to get that data into clusters. So, um, before I get to my interpretation of the data, I'd like to talk about the process and all the different information that I learned to get to my end result. So I started by importing the data in from the CSV file, which was much easier for me to get that initiated into the text file. And then we use a corpus widget, which basically allows you to take information from a text file and interpret text data. And then from there, we added a word cloud, which is basically a visual representation of words, and in this case, characters as well, um, of how many times a certain word or character will show up within this text file, which can be um, pretty useful when determining what words were used more frequently and coming to various interpretations based upon that data. But the problem is that we can see from this original word cloud that various words like and, the, was, I, all these different characters, period, comma, and words like that are kind of taking the bulk of the data because obviously those filler words and punctuations are going to be used a lot more commonly than the words that we're actually searching for. So we learned how to kind of filter that out here by uh, using the pre-processed text widget. This widget allows you to filter various words, transform various phrases, and determine tokenizations. Ultimately, the goal of pre-processed text is to help you filter out those types of words, right? So, in order to start, like, there's no URLs, anything like that, no accents, so we didn't need to worry about that. All of these we actually left at default. So lowercase is checked. And then for the tokenization, we started with the default, basically regular characters, no word punctuation, so we're not gonna have periods, we're not gonna have commas, things like that. And then finally, for pre-processed text, we came across the filtering option, and this one we learned how to filter out specific words. And in order to do so, you can basically start by getting a text file. So we choose like Notepad, and then basically you could go through and type out a word line by line, and you're basically going to save that. And then once you save that, you're able to insert it into this filtering file, and then based upon how that's used in the text file, it will automatically filter out those specific words for you that you've chosen. Although in this case, like you can see here, there was no file that I need to insert because there were no words based upon this word cloud that I felt I needed to specifically filter out because this data was pretty good to start with. It started talking about the same topics that I need to be representing, which is like food, place, good, service, great, back, like. These are all types of words to start with that I need to be uh, making an interpretation from. So I decided to keep all of these words within my data, which ends up being very beneficial. And then from this data, we can see that like food has the most weight with 125, place used 106 times, good 94, service 85, great 70. You can see all this. So we can really determine what the top words were, like good service, good place, good food. I'd like to assume that's what they're saying. Um, but based upon this data, we can see that these are some of the top words, and that's pretty important. Next, we learned how to use the bag of words widget, which basically will categorize words. And then for this one, we kept this at the default, which was count, none, and none. So we're just basing it upon the count. And then from here, if you look further into the clustering, we'd go from, and I'll talk about these later, but we'd go from bag of words to distances to hierarchical uh, clustering. But the problem was that there wasn't, the attributes weren't set up correctly. So the distances would have an error, and this wasn't turning out the way we wanted it to be. So in order to fix that problem, we discussed that we needed to add the select column widget, and basically all we did was move liked from features to meta attributes, and that way we were able to correctly create the clusters throughout this widget process. So the next widget, based upon this data, is the distances widget. And then this one is not default. This one we do determine as distance metric cosine based upon the tutorial videos. And then once we finally have all of this process, basically you don't need these. These are just to help determine or kind of explain my viewpoints of why I chose to use certain variables. But basically, right here, this process, once this is what we tried to make using that process, right? So this is a very interesting form of data. This shows the various clusters, and then you can determine the various clusters or how many clusters you want by using this slide right here. So we could have clusters of 1 or 2 data points or reviews, but basically I started with 4. So right here, I believe. Here we go. So I got my 4 clusters here. And basically from these clusters, we can, this is where I start to get into the interpretation of the data. And basically, let's go cluster by cluster. And for the first cluster, we could determine that most of this was, yes, like most of these reviews were liked reviews based upon this cluster determination, although it does appear that there are a fair amount of no's, so this might be closer. Nah, this is definitely closer to liked. So this cluster determines that there's more liked reviews than there are not. And then for the next one, we can see that within this cluster, that most of the reviews determine that the restaurants were disliked for some form or fashion, but most of this cluster was a disliked cluster. And then we can go into the third cluster. When we look at this one, we can see that this has a large proportion of no's, although we can see that it's fairly close to 50-50. I'd say it definitely leans more towards not being liked, but we'd be able to further analyze that in other graphical representations. And we move on to the next cluster. We can see here that most of these are yes. Within this cluster, whatever the determination is, most of these reviews were liked. So whatever is being bracketed into this cluster is presenting a good review with the customers. Then when we go to the final cluster that I'd like to look at, this one has a lot of data. So this cluster alone might even be one that you break down into further points, but just for the sake of this video, we can kind of tell that it's roughly 50-50. It'd be easier to determine the more you break it down, but we can kind of even look at this. So based upon the selected data, lots of ones and zeros, like there's a large chunk down here, but we can determine that this is pretty close to 50-50. There might be more weighing towards being disliked reviews. But overall, we learned how to use this clustering system, how to break it down and further simplify the data that we want to get expressed into these final clusters, and then how to make an interpretation based upon those clusters. So this is my assignment 11. Thank you.